Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Vincent Garnier. I'm the Director General of the FTTH Council Europe. The panel is titled, Do the Economics of Fiber Built Out Stack Up? It's clear that we've been talking today and I understand yesterday also about many subjects, and all applications are eventually requiring a very high capacity network, and fiber is definitely the best technology to ensure for the future a very efficient and sustainable way of providing connectivity to manage all applications that you guys have been discussing during this event. So clearly the rollout of fiber matters for everyone and for every application. And the right question is, after such a very impressive deployment of fiber throughout Europe and also specifically in the UK, what to expect next? Are we at a turning point? Is the rollout going to continue? What comes next? That's a little bit the topic of today. So with me today, I have on my left Clayton Nash, Strategy Director of CityFibre. CityFibre, I guess everybody knows the operator, alternative operator in the UK wholesale model, but Clayton will have the opportunity to tell us more about his company. And on my right is Oliver Helm, and Oliver is Chief Executive at Full Fibre. You've noticed, I think, on the main slide that José Pedro Nascimento from Altice Portugal was also planned to be with us. He has to be excused. He has difficulty to join London today. I think he had some conflicting last-minute commitment. So it will be the three of us, and I guess I might be able, in my capacity of Director General of the FTTH Council, to bring some pan-European perspective on some of these topics. And since we are a small group, I would welcome any question from the audience to make this panel and this interaction more lively. So I would like to start with the general economic context. We witness a rise in inflation, high interest rates, economic uncertainties, and after quite a few years of growth and very healthy deployment of fiber, I'm wondering, is that economic context has an impact on how your company is able to finance or refinance the project of deployment in your area based on your business plan? Maybe starting with you, Clayton.
Sure, thanks, Vincent. I mean, it would be pretty insane to deny that we're living in a slightly different economic period than we were 24 months ago. Certainly, I think for the industry as a whole, what this has meant is a period of more uncertainty and attempting to make sure that whatever debt and equity you have in place stretches out beyond the period that we don't understand. The sense here is that 23 is not going to be great, 24 might be a bit painful, but we will have some light at the end of the tunnel coming out of 24. So as long as you can survive through there, you're going to be fine in many senses. I always like to say it's better to be lucky than good, and we were very lucky and very good in that we closed our debt round in March of last year, raising just a little under £5 billion of debt. So, from our point of view, we're very comfortable that our plan's financed. We can continue to execute, but clearly there's going to be, we're not going to rush in terms of what we're doing. We're going to take a set of sensible decisions. And I think we've seen with a number of other players in the market, even those who are well-financed, everyone's taking a sort of, let's keep it steady kind of approach. We still believe in our plans. We still believe the take-up is there. We still believe the demand is there. But you need to be here at the end of the process in order to execute your plan and reap the rewards of your build, right? So I think the industry is going to not going to be quite as fast as it was, but it's definitely not going to disappear or kind of radically slow down in any sense.
And with Oliver, same question from your perspective?
It's very hard to add or disagree with anything on that, I think, to be honest. I mean, aside from the fact that the UK is a complete basket case, it's driving forwards a shake-up that particularly in the UK is much needed. Operators that were expecting very short, very fast returns that were frankly unrealistic probably are going to fall by the wayside as part of this activity. But the reality is the sensible fibre propositions, particularly the wholesale propositions, are very long-term investments anyway. So yes, the cost of capital is going to hurt the IRR slightly, but the reality is, 2 years in a fibre network, it is a pinch point, it is in deployment, but actually if you've got a credible plan, you've got a clear path to the EBITDA margins that make sense at the back of it, actually people are still willing to fund that, they're still willing to push it through. You just have to accept you are going to pay a higher premium on that capital for a while. These networks are the universal access layer. They are required to fuel everything from mobile to IoT to EV through to just straight connectivity. They're a utility, and investors like utilities because they're there for the long term.
But nevertheless, do you see any risk, maybe not for your organization, but looking at the market around you, with the new, a need for refinancing coming up in the next 2-3 years? Is it going to impact the landscape as we see it today?
I mean, in the UK in particular, nobody's really refinancing at the point that they're looking for distributions to their shareholders. They're redistributing purely for that continued growth and continued development. And I think, as Clayton said, people are slowing down their build plans a little bit. There's less of the gold rush, less of the land grab strategy. It's more about let's build these pragmatic relationships, let's build the pragmatic networks. Frankly, we've also done a lot of the easy, quick build now. We're moving into the slightly harder, slightly slower build anyway in a lot of these places. So it's kind of come at a natural point in deployment. So ultimately, I don't think it's really going to impact progress. I don't think it's really going to impact the fundamentals of most of the businesses that are solid anyway.
I would tend to agree. If I look at pan-European view, the study that we're providing at the FTTH Council really show that for the next 5 years, we kind of project a continuation of the rollout of fibre at the same pace as what we know today. Maybe we're a little bit too optimistic, but nevertheless, we kind of see the growth. When we talk to investors, we have similar view whereby they think that the business model, the long-term perspective, the value for infrastructure investment, and as you said, looking at 20, 30 years ahead, they still think that the business case is very solid. Of course, the cost is higher, maybe the expectation in return is higher, so investors are a bit more careful in the way they invest, but their willingness to invest and the availability in cash is there.
But I think particularly in the UK, what it's doing is it's driving rational behaviour. We're seeing people not wanting to drive 3, 4, 5 fibre cables into a single premises because the economics don't stack up. They never did. But the cost of capital has really brought that home hard and fast. So I think we'll see the same volume of premises delivered. We might see fewer fibre cables in the ground, but the penetration, I think, will be pretty parity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Oliver. And, parts of the country, that rationality kicked in a while ago, really. I think certainly in London, we saw Reality visit a number of people fairly recently. But even in this environment, we saw a £300 million raise by Tube just, a month ago. In this environment, the good vendors will be able to finance. Yes, it'll be more difficult, but it will go forward. I mean, we keep looking back. I hear this quite a lot, kind of the fibre blowout that happened in the UK back in the 90s when we had MFS and a series of other entities that are out there and what happened to them. But we forget, of course, that all of those networks are still in place. They're still businesses today making money, right? That business plan may not have paid out at a multiple of 50 times, but everyone made money off those businesses at the end of the day, right? And it's going to be the same here. Some will fall by the wayside, but the good operators who've got a good plan will be here in 25 years and will still be using those networks.
And Oliver, you hinted on the fact that the easy part of the rollout has been done, and we are now getting it. Like in many countries in Europe, you start in the densely populated area where the business case makes a lot of sense, and when it comes to rural, ultra-rural, things are a bit changing because it doesn't necessarily stack up economically for a private investor. You require some state intervention. There's also that question of regulation, how things are organized. What is your view on that situation for the UK, and maybe more generally speaking, what needs to be done to cover this very remote area? I think your company focuses on underserved community, so you must have some specific points on that.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you say organised and regulator in the same sentence, which in this country doesn't really work. This country, the regulator is Openreach and vice versa. I think, the rural areas, yes, they are a higher case. They're a harder case to build it's a lot more capital, it's a lot slower, and there are definitely places that we won't get to. Government subsidies are a really interesting point. They can do more damage than good. They are definitely needed in some parts of the country, but I think what we're really seeing is that there are places the market will go, and it's a timing factor. And we in particular have concern about some of the UK subsidy schemes about actually where they just introduce risk into our commercial build programme, there might be subsidised build in some of the same areas. So it's very hard, particularly when a market is so competitive and there's so much build going on, for a government to accurately assess where intervention is really needed. We have to accept there are places fibre is never going to go. There are places it's just never going to be commercially viable for anybody. But yeah, they're slower build, they're hard to justify, they take time to do it, but actually there's still for a vast amount of areas a commercial case for doing it, as long as you're not expecting, as long as you're expecting low single-digit IRR out of them, not high teens, which some of the high-density stuff has expected.
And I guess overbuilding in very remote areas do not really make sense. So how do you envisage to really maximize the coverage and avoid white areas and creating digital divide while maintaining a competitive environment for rollout in rural area? Or does it need a little bit of organization and regulation, as we said?
Yeah, competition in rural areas is really tricky, and that's why fostering wholesale networks is really, really important. And that's where the incumbent will always have an advantage, and there's always going to be a need for an incumbent. An incumbent can subsidise deep rural build that frankly is going to have a very, very slow return on investment in it through very high volumes of high density build with a much stronger IRR. And there are places where alternative networks that don't have that are just never going to be able to make a business case wash underneath it. There are parts of the UK that as a challenger, it's just not viable to build. I think that's the case across Europe and the rest of the world, really.
And at CityFibre, the name City is in the company, so does it mean you only focus on cities, or are you also concerned by deployment in low density areas?
So we're participating now in the government's BDUK program. We've won some lots in that process, and we'll be building out in some of those really difficult to build areas. At our last board strategy day, I was actually asked, should we change the name? I just had a lot of business cards printed, so I wasn't particularly a big fan of that. But ultimately, we will participate in that process, right? The current government structure is maybe not perfect, but they are trying to do the right thing. They've been burnt very badly in the past by dealing with just one counterparty, and that didn't really work out. Personally, I'd like to see more experimentation. I think the French model of essentially joint build with a franchise is a really interesting one that we might want to explore here. It's all about certainty, right? If you can create an environment of certainty for a long period of time, the investment will come and people will build that in the right way. But as Oliver said, the other thing you need to avoid is creating a monopoly that ultimately just drives prices up in those locations. It's no good connecting some rural location if they have to pay 50 or 100 pounds a month and everyone else is paying 20, right? Yeah. So you need to balance that off correctly. We think the wholesale model brings a lot of that competition pretty much automatically, and we're big fans of that process. Yeah. But yeah, we've won one. We're in the process of starting to build that. We just saw one of two of the other lots. The first customer's been connected, so it seems to be working so far. Yeah. Let's see.
But actually, the situation in the UK, if we take a step back and compare the UK with the rest of Europe, is not bad as far as penetration of fibre in rural areas. There are countries in Europe where really the coverage of fibre in very rural area is lagging much behind the average coverage which is noticed in the rest of the country, while in the UK, a lot of fibre has been deployed actually by alternative operator in rural first. Yep. And currently the penetration of fibre in rural area is just behind the average in the UK. So compared to other countries, the UK is doing quite good.
I think so, yeah. The great thing about the UK market is that the incumbent is really terrible at many things, right? So it gave people an opportunity to do that. There's a holiday house we rent every year, and it's got 3 megabit broadband, and my kids hate it. And we went out a few months ago, and someone had rolled out fibre into this little village of about 70 homes. And I walked up the high street and counted all the boxes on the outside, and there's 70% take-up in this thing that they put in a year ago, right? So the business case is absolutely there. It can be done by others. And I agree that the UK's got a lot to be proud of in this space, right? Mm-hmm. Europe's done really well, but Europe's not one thing. We keep forgetting, right? Go to rural Germany, go to rural Austria, it's horrible.
Absolutely. And the capital costs vary accordingly. But it's also, the complexity of building in these different countries is vastly different. You look at France. France was able to use a concession model. It was able to take sort of volume commitments on take-up in some of the rural areas. But the assurance over the rate of rollout is slightly simpler and slightly easier in those areas. Parts of the UK, there can be more bureaucracy and more complexity in those rural areas. Sort of volume commit requires some sort of assurance of build volume underneath it, and that's harder to deliver, I think, a little bit. So very different markets. Germany is a heavily pre-sell market in the rural area before some of this stuff rolls out. And I think the real challenge is, you talk about 70% penetration in Little Village. Yeah, that's great, but that's probably an integrated network, and it's probably there because it can pre-sell to a small volume. The challenge is how that really scales up, which is, we see you guys participating in the tenders, and you are wholesale, you can do that. It's now how we leverage that at scale across the UK, so we don't end up with a CP monopoly as well as a network monopoly into these small areas. Because let's face it, we can't put significant market power on lots of networks with 10,000 prems underneath them to make a fair deal for the customer. So the challenge becomes how sustainable are those networks in the long run? How do we get to them to scale? As and when consolidation happens, how can they be integrated into other businesses at a sensible price point? The UK is doing well in a lot of the rural space. There's a lot more to do. It now becomes how do we keep that competitive dynamic for the customer? I as Clayton, I'm a huge advocate of the wholesale proposition underneath that. And we can't forget that the fibre is needed not just for the premises. We've got to bring 5G into these areas. We've got to bring smart services into these areas and all these other things that we need to amortize and leverage. And I think no business model has yet got to a point where it can firmly bake the revenue from that sort of third stream into it. We have built the converged network now. This can do anything. It can do any haul. It is huge capacity. How are we actually going to sweat that, and what does that actually look like in terms of numbers? It's an upside for most models rather than something we can firmly bake in yet.
So you've mentioned business model. You're both wholesale only operator, and that's not the case in every country. In some, you mentioned Germany. In Germany, this is very tough for wholesale only, because somehow you need to be two to tango. If you don't have an ISP to run on your network, you have no revenue, and in some countries it works better than others. So how do you see moving forward? Because rollout, you anticipate on all these deals, but once the fiber is there will come a time when you need to run the business, to get ISP, and the market will need to stabilize with different roles. So how do you see that balance between the incumbent, between large ISPs and maybe hundreds now of wholesale operator in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the UK scale is over-egged. There are 100 people technically building, but I think there are really only about 15 with any scale. So I think the UK market is a lot more sensible than it looks on the face of it. Ultimately, I can only see wholesale as good news for the consumer. It's all well and good trying to encourage infrastructure-level competition, and that works in places. But what you really need is that competitive dynamic for the end user that CPs can deliver. That drives good value, that breaks down the economic divide, that allows social opportunity to happen underneath it. And yes, from my point of view, that means that there's less direct control, direct ARPU underneath it. But I think what people forget is that scaling, well, people don't forget, but what a lot of the UK space certainly forgets, is that scaling the consumer-facing operation is hugely complex, it's hugely expensive, and it's much more speculative on the capital. When I spend capital, I'm ploughing it into asset into the ground, and it's very tangible from day one. When a consumer CP is spending capital, it's much more speculative as to whether they're going to acquire that customer, at what price they're going to acquire them, and how long they're going to stay around for. The competitive tension in that market is a different specialty. It's really important for the consumer. From my point of view, yes, you need those, but the UK is dominated by a small number of incumbents. And while we've got challengers, actually it's now about what's the economic imperative for the incumbent to move their customer base off legacy, expensive, poor quality, poor experience copper and onto a better, best-in-class, high-quality, future-proof network that offers better OpEx for them. And that's what fibre is.
Yeah, there's no doubt that from an investor perspective, the readability of a wholesale model is much better.
Yep.
They can control costs. The business model is simple, very easy to understand, very predictable, compared to vertically integrated and converged operator where things are much more complex.
Yeah. And when cost of capital is higher or challenging capital to come from, you can pivot a wholesale operation fairly quickly. You can change your build rate, you can change your overheads, you can change your strategy, you can move between rural and urban. You know, comparatively, I mean, these things are all big engines to move, but you can pivot that activity. A fully integrated operation has very high fixed overheads from day one, and it's very hard to pivot that and adjust things as your capital, your access to capital, your cost of capital moves. So yeah, you accept higher risk earlier on a wholesale model. You can't go and warm that market in quite the same way you can with an integrated provider. But at the same stage, you don't have as much, the chance of a challenger coming through saying, I can do this better by laying the infrastructure underneath it and underbuilding you is significantly lower because you're providing that competitive dynamic layer to your end users. So I think the security of tenure in the long run on a wholesale network is very, very high. The security of tenure in the very immediate term on an integrated network is stronger, but that dissipates very, very quickly, certainly after the first 20% of the penetration curve.
And Clayton, how do you somehow de-risk the model by ensuring that you have, you find customer, you will find them on the long run and guarantee that access to the end user?
So we did it the other way around. We got the customers before we built the network, which is something we're very proud of, right? So we've never put a pound in the ground without knowing who's paying for it. So the first version of what we did, we had Vodafone commit to buying parts of that network from us before we built it. That was our first 1 million homes. TalkTalk fundamentally kind of came on, and both of them have committed to the network and committed to purchasing off the back of that. So our model was pretty de-risked to start with, right? We need to top that up. We need to also get the kind of other laggard ISPs, the ones who are just essentially now refusing to commit to this new world, to kind of move across, right? And there's one name here, which I think we all understand. But these networks are great for consumers, right? And it's insane that we're not seeing the ISPs commit to more of them, right? And it's a market failure if you see an ISP with 25% market share refusing to buy a cheaper access from somebody else, right? What has happened there, right? It's not because they're lazy and incompetent, right? Something else is going on. So we're super comfortable because we were de-risked to start with. That's why we were able to raise the money. That's why we were able to commit to the build. That's why we were able to say, I'm fully funded to do this, right? Others have taken a slightly different path there, but I think it'll end up in the right place for them as well. The ISPs need to come to the market and realize their cozy cartel world of just waiting and kind of trading 10,000 customers a year between themselves is over, right? Where customers are realizing that there's a better choice out there and they're going to drive change in the space. And that means that ultimately they'll start to come into Oliver's network and our network as well.
And I guess the quality of your value proposition also comes from the quality and performance of your network. So what roles does technology play? And if we look towards the future, what are your plans to make sure that you're at the forefront of what sort of connectivity you can offer?
So, I think the technology question is in some sense answered itself, right? We now know the world's going to look like an XGS-PON world, and we'll just have some iterations on that as the speeds get bigger, right? We've committed to that. Virtually all the other altnets are building some version of XGS. So from a technology point of view, just a base technology, we know what that looks like. But technology is not what drives a great customer experience, right? It's a promise that you deliver on. The UK consumer is a bit like kind of a dog that's been chained out in the rain every night for the last 5 years, right? They don't expect anything better. And until you show them that there's a better path, they don't realize that life can look up. There's sun and there's delicious dog food inside the house as well. We're starting to see that. It's not enough for me to have great technology. I have to deliver at every single point that I touch a customer and delight them, just as a base, right, to kind of get them out of the stupor that they're in. It's simple things. We get incredible feedback from people saying things like, you turned up on time for the appointment, right? That's a pretty kind of terrible indictment of the way we've been running the network to date, that customers are delighted that I turned up when I said I would and the service worked when I left, right? That said, we are using the technology to drive much more customer service stuff through there, right? It's simple things like you could look through our network. All of our ISPs can send network probes and kind of figure out how the speeds are working all the way to the end customer. Why? Because I'm not ashamed of how my network runs, right? I give access to all of the APIs for troubleshooting and so forth to the ISPs. Why? Because when someone calls up, the conversation you don't want to have is, I don't know where the problem is. It might cost you 100 quid for me to fix it, and you need to commit before I know what's going on. By the way, the guy can turn up in a week and a half to fix your essential broadband connection, right? The conversation you want to have is, I can see everything. I know where the problem is. I know who needs to fix it. And by the way, they're going to be there fairly soon. Even better, they're already working on it, and it's going to be sorted out in the background, right? So the technology drives not just the choice of what we deploy in the field, but how we use that, how we expose that to the customers, and how, at the end of the day, that affects the end user, right?
And for you?
I think monopolistic providers are not very good at innovating, and that's why challenges exist. It's absolutely about the consumer experience space. I think traditionally, globally, we've seen wholesalers also be less good at that. Wholesalers have been much more hands-off, stand back, leave it to the CP. And that's because we've very rarely seen true wholesale competition. Where we are seeing true wholesale competition, we're now seeing that deep innovation, and it is around the customer service point. How do I make it so much easier for my CPs and for the end user to do that? And we're also, we're starting to slightly blur the lines of what a wholesaler is. A wholesaler is no longer so hands-off. I'm more engaged with the end user than I would have been 5 years ago, and certainly than Openreach is now. And the technology is the massive enabler for that. The ability for us to use AI and ML models and all that sort of stuff to preempt damage, to preempt repair, to proactively notify people. The idea that your provider tells you that your internet's not working before you ring them up for 2 hours on hold. There is nothing worse than ringing a provider. You sit on hold, you're frustrated before you even start talking to them. They then say, okay, I'll go and have a look. And probably somebody in a call center who's not paid enough to do the job seriously. It is all about that customer experience and innovating really heavily with the technology. The network technology, as Clayton said,
when you say customer
kind of
experience, are you talking about your ISP as a customer or the end user customer?
Both.
Both. Yeah, because one of the thing which we are clearly looking at is if we want to increase demand for fiber, if we want ultimately we want to ensure that every customer connected on fiber gets the best experience. And for that, very often, their only point of contact with the network is Wi-Fi. They're not buying a full fiber network with a beautiful central office and fantastic communication nodes. What they want is that they turn on the Wi-Fi, it works, and they can watch whatever they want to see on their tablet or access any application. So how do you intervene in that crucial part, which is in-home, in-premises connectivity, to ensure that, and you kind of mentioned that, which is about transparency, visibility, being able to act in anticipation and...
Yeah, the problem isn't so much the Wi-Fi itself, that's what's causing the issue underneath it. The problem is that it's just too complicated and too many moving parts for the consumer, so they tune out. Your brain just goes, it's not working, that's normal, I accept that now. That's, again, it's down to competition. We have to encourage challenger CPs to deliver a better level of customer service, and we have to give them the tooling and functionality to be able to do that at a low cost. If they can scrutinize my network all the way up to the ONT through the front door and assure that that's perfect at virtually zero touch and zero cost to them, they can then focus on innovating for an excellent in-house customer experience. And by allowing that competition onto these networks, on true wholesale networks, we are seeing challenger CPs coming up. They're starting to challenge the incumbents. We're seeing the incumbents react and change accordingly. It is all about competition and people having to win consumers. And people have just got, people are finally waking up, certainly in the UK, that the crap they have at the moment isn't an acceptable solution. They should be able to demand more, and there is an alternative way out there to get it.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of kind of challenger ISPs is really fascinating to me, because we're starting to actually see innovation in that space for the first time. We've got an ISP on our network who, the CEO comes from kind of Uber world, right, app-based worlds, and he looks at this completely differently to how I've seen ISPs do this before. So his entire interface is the app and how that works. And he asked us a question a few months ago. He said, can you send me a photograph of the installer and let me know who's going to be installing? I was like, that's a very weird request. Why? And he went, well, because a lot of single women are home waiting for the installation, and they'd like to know who's knocking on the door. And you're like, wow, that's a really great kind of point. None of us had ever thought of that before. So now we tell you who's the installation, right? But it's that level of innovation at how does this feel for me as someone walks through my door? that we've never had before, right? I can't do that as a wholesaler, but I've got ISPs like asking me all kinds of crazy questions trying to do stuff, and I think that's super great.
Absolutely. How are we doing time-wise? We're good? 10 minutes. Maybe time to take some questions from the audience before we wrap it up.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Agim from Applause. In a previous life, I worked a lot with the company we won't name. I've also worked with Network Rail and their telco disaster situation. There's a lot of capability already below ground. There's a lot of infrastructure already below ground, but there doesn't seem to be, or at least from a government perspective, there hasn't been a real leveraging of existing capability and collaboration opportunities to really maximize the opportunity to deliver in 2025 instead of the new date now in 2030. Do you see perhaps local authorities or someone else acting as that central point of contact for organizations to collaborate with and maybe leverage the opportunities that can be brought together? Because I know Essex, for example, has tried to be the first local authority to have full fibre and stuff like that. So could that be an opportunity, do you think?
Absolutely. I think we see very different experiences between the local authorities that we deal with, right? To the point now where kind of if we don't get commitment from the local authority, it's not something we really want to, a place we want to enter. There's one council kind of on the south coast on the beach who has a whole bunch of different priorities, and it's been a huge nightmare kind of doing anything there, and it's lesson learned, right? They don't want to do this in a sense. Whereas in other cases, we've got councils who recognize the difference this can make, and not just because you can watch better Netflix, right? They've got a bunch of social housing where people need the stuff to apply for jobs and deal with all kinds of incapacity issues and so forth. They see the outcome. Dealing with those guys is a delight, right? Because they drive the right outcome. They hold you to account, but they also want to achieve the right thing, and that works really well for us. So I do see this kind of moving much more local. People who care will get what they want. People who don't see the future, I think, will find they've been left behind.
Total agreement. I mean, local authorities need to digitalise. There's huge cost savings for them to leverage. Where they need to unlock social mobility, digital is absolutely the key and the underpinning for that. There are resources in the UK it'd be lovely to access, fibre down the rail network, all that sort of thing. But the cost of doing business with them or even trying to do business with them is just so fiendishly complicated that it's cheaper to buy it myself, build it myself. And at least then we know we can fix it when it goes wrong.
From a regulatory standpoint, when it comes to the local permits and getting access to builds, I mean, how would you describe the UK right now? Or are you looking for some regulatory help there that's coming in the pipeline?
I love more help.
Oh, yeah.
I would always take more freedom, but it's actually a fairly supportive environment for the most part. We're seeing way leaves and so forth starting to be unlocked. There's some specific government groups that are now looking at how they unlock some of those blocking points. So from a local build point of view, I think it's a pretty supportive environment. I know some people in Germany, and they just cry when they speak to us, right? This is a fairly sensible place to build. It's not as wonderful as France, but it's pretty good. I think where the regulatory issues are not at that level, it's at the business case level and the kind of official regulator process of where we are. So.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think it's slightly insane how much we have to pay for permit access, given that this is something that's needed for the economy. But yeah, the streetworks regulation is not the challenge. It's the telecoms regulation and regulatory capture is a very significant challenge within that.
Are we all talking about Equinox 2 but not naming it?
I'll name it, right? Yeah. So, look, we're pretty happy about the Equinox 2 outcome in a sense, right? Everyone kind of yelled at us when we challenged this stuff, saying, "Don't you want better prices?" Like, I love better prices. I will compete on price day in and day out. That's not the part I was worried about, right? I was worried about Equinox 3, Equinox 4, Equinox 5, right? Because there was a big secret sign somewhere saying, if you just play ball you'll get more discounts, you'll get more stuff, right? What we have now is certainty at last, right? Pricing's fine. I'm cheaper than OpenReach everywhere, right? So I'm happy with my pricing. I'm happy with Equinox 2 pricing. I don't like the loyalty-inducing effects, but I know they're done, right? Everyone can now make a decision for the next 3 to 4 years and understand what the pricing environment will be. And there's not a sort of secret kind of treat dangling in the background saying, if only, if only, if only. So, yeah, was it the perfect outcome? No. Was it an outcome that's really going to work? I think it is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Are there
Any more questions?
Hi, I am Hari from Tata Communications Transformation Services. With hundreds of altnets deploying fiber across the country, and we are in the hype of building networks, how do we see the economies of scale in terms of customer acquisitions and improving the utilization of the asset what we built?
Do you want to go, Oliver? Then I can agree with you.
It's just not possible to maintain that many networks. Scale is critical. You can tentatively at 250,000 prems make a business case work, but you're not at sufficient scale to attract the CPs onto your network at that stage. It's just not worth somebody with 20% of the market share for consumers in the UK dealing with you at 250,000 prems. It's too complicated, it's too expensive, it's too much hassle. You can't drive that take as an integrated provider much further than 25% anyway. So I think we'll end up with a bunch of more Scandinavian style outfits that are slightly more bespoke providers and that run more as almost more towards family firm end of the scale. And I don't mean that to be patronising. I think they're perfectly viable businesses. But I don't think we'll have that many that get to the real scale. And there really are only 15 people building in the UK at significant scale at the moment. The rest are very much subscale, and I think they've missed the opportunity to get to that major scale point now. We'll see some consolidation. We'll see a lot of merger where PE can't take a haircut on it. And we'll see quite a lot fall by the wayside over the next few years. The real challenge is, given we've got a very established build engine, CityFibre, we've got a very established build engine. If you're building tens of thousands per prems per month at a very sensible cost point, it's not worth acquiring a network that doesn't have very high penetration on it. And the UK market space is too green to have very high penetration on fibre networks pretty much anywhere. So it's going to be challenging for some of them. Scale is absolutely vital if you're going to get deep enough penetration to maintain a long-term proposition.
I can just agree with all of that. And we've started to see that happen already, right? The Fern Group entities have all been pushed together in one blob. And I think we're going to see more of that. So ultimately, some subset of the 15 are going to survive, and the others are going to get absorbed in there. But I think first they need to come together in coherent pieces of 50 to 100,000 homes that you can kind of deal with sensibly.
Are there any? Oh, okay. Here we go. You first.
You seem to be portraying a very similar thing that happened with the UK cable industry, which is basically consolidate to one.
Imagine the exact opposite of what the UK cable industry turned into, yes.
How so?
I think dealing with cable is equivalent to sticking hot needles in your eyes these days, whereas my customers like me. So from that point of view, I don't think this is a cable outcome, right?
I didn't mean in terms of the customer experience. I meant in terms of the consolidation of the industry. Because you mentioned earlier, for example, the issue of getting service providers to use you rather. You talked about TalkTalk using you, but many of the others. The biggest challenge for them is if I have 5, 10 wholesale suppliers, I need to integrate with 5, 10 wholesale suppliers. I need to provide a product that is uniform across those 10 suppliers, and that becomes a big issue. And that's really where I'm sort of saying that
so
the inevitable thing.
Putting aside my sarcastic
large
comments earlier.
competitor to OpenReach, really.
Yeah, no, that's a perfectly sensible question. It's possible, right? One of the outcomes here is there are 2 or 3 networks left standing at the end of this process, and everything just gets kind of smashed together. However, there are other models that have worked really well. In Scandinavia, there are maybe 250 operators, and it works, right? Now, that's Scandinavia. They have some different processes. But there is an economic model that works. I think what we have to realize is 30 or 40 years ago, all that stuff was physical integration and it was horribly slow and deadly, right? Today, 90% of the stuff is software. And you can drag some fiber around, plug the networks between each other, and do the integration sensibly, and it works. And you don't have to drive to lowest common denominator products because I can only think of one thing, right? In a world where we can address an individual consumer on Facebook with an ad and a directed proposition, why are we still talking about TalkTalk can only do one product across the whole country, right? The innovation we're talking about needs to be driven across the entire base, right? Customers need to stand up as well and say, like, I'm not a kind of a household, right? These households are vastly different. 3 students sharing a house versus a family of 4 look very different. They want to do very different things, but we continue with this process of saying, oh, it's efficient for Sky to have just one proposition with 3 speeds, right? That's insane, right? The world's driven by software now. You can redefine this stuff on the fly. There's an infinite amount of bandwidth we can supply to this process. But somehow all the propositions look pretty much like what they did 10 years ago, but twice as fast, right? There is definitely an outcome which doesn't look like the cable networks, one thing, all smashed together, a single proposition, right?
That software point's so important. 7 cable networks, all of them bordering on various degrees of distress underneath them, 8 billing platforms between them, and a nightmare and huge cost to integrate, right? Long period of time. You can integrate fiber networks extremely quickly. You can make it look like, from a consumer's perspective, that you've done it virtually overnight while you do the works underneath it. It's not a complicated thing to do. But I also think that, we will end up with probably at least 5 networks in the UK that are viable in their own right. And if they choose to merge, it will probably be out of synergies and opportunity rather than a necessity to do it in a fragmented market. I also think we still talk about it as if it's always going to be the same way. It's always going to be Sky, Voda, BT, that lot in the UK, Orange, Telefonica, all that lot as we move across Europe. I wouldn't be surprised if it looks completely different in 5 years' time if we're actually talking about the hyperscalers bundling this in with other services. The means by which we're going to connect consumers is going to look fundamentally different, and whether that's we provide a household or hyperscaler provides an individual house in a household using the technology that's there. The fibre can support all of that. It's got that flexibility underneath it. And I think the way that consumers procure connectivity will be fundamentally different in the next 5 to 10 years, and we just don't know what that's going to look like yet. But it won't be, here's a contract for your broadband for that property.
I would just like to, I think we're coming to the end of this session. I would like to give the opportunity to our panelists to conclude, maybe answering the question, what keeps you awake at night in an optimistic way? What makes you very happy to start your job in the morning? And what are your main challenges for the time to come?
Every so often we go out and visit a city, and I speak to somebody whose life we've transformed with fibre. And that's a trite statement, right? But we've spoken to people who, there was one woman we dealt with who, her broadband was so terrible that every Friday afternoon she had to drive to her sister's house in London to upload her work for the week, right? And she got this fibre. She didn't even buy like a gigabit, but it meant that on Friday afternoon she kind of clicked a button, made a cup of tea, and her work for the week was done. And she was home on Friday to see her daughter come home from school. She hadn't done that in 3 years. And it's that personal touch of fibre, right? We're taking away all the friction in people's lives. And that's what keeps me optimistic, that this is a fundamental human need to communicate, and we're enabling that, and I feel really proud to be part of that process. A very small part of that, but I'm still there. What keeps me up from a concern point of view? We need to ensure the business is sustainable going forward, right? And that we protect ourselves in all the right way. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. Every week I get asked what's happening with a variety of things. And we need to kind of make sense of that and make very clear the business model is solid. The outcome's not going to be what you thought it was going to be, but it's going to be a good outcome for everybody, as long as we keep our nerve and kind of head forward into the future.
Thank you.
Oliver, the last word? Largely agree. The fact that we can innovate, we can fundamentally change this proposition, and we can fundamentally change people's prospects by innovating. We can make this frictionless, we can make it exciting, we can make it lower cost, we can make it more dependable, we can change people's access and ability to gain work, education, CPD, all that stuff underneath it. And we can do that more and more with a smaller handful of extremely clever people in front of laptops. It's not just about digging up the road, we're fundamentally changing things underneath this. What keeps me awake at night? Yeah, same things. You know, I worry a little bit about irrational behaviour in the market over the next few months. As some people hit pinch points, there is going to be some irrationality around that. But I think we're well placed to weather that out. It's just making sure that it is a level playing field, particularly in those rural areas, that there is, you know, the right incentives for networks to continue to roll out.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you for the great question from the audience. And I'm sure you will be able to network with anyone at the end of the session.
Yes.